Hey, social media fam. One of the things that I said I would be sharing with you this month are some of the books that I'm reading. I am really putting my library card to good use this summer, and actually this year I've been doing pretty good. And I decided to share some of the books that I've been reading. This one I really wanted to do a video on, just kind of clear my mind because it was a bit of a tough read. I hate to start with something tough, but I just need to get it off my chest. So I actually returned the book already. Sorry. But I did finish it, and it is called, just looking down at my notes, it's called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. Y'all. Just a little bit of background. I love sociology. So I did not major in sociology, but it was the discipline that I took the most classes in next to my actual major in college. So even once I left college, I was still fascinated by the subject. And this right here, when I saw I think I heard about it on a podcast, and I looked it up in our library system to see if we had it. Was so happy to find it. And I was interested in this because I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which was very, very segregated. And in some parts of the city, it still is. And I wanted to know more about the evolution of that, how that developed. Because I knew more, it had to be more involved than just people saying, okay, we want these folks over here and we want these folks over here. It had to be a little bit more systematic. And this particular book, while it does not delve specifically into Richmond, it does mention Richmond in passing. And I need to double check because I can't remember because it didn't go into detail about Richmond, but it talks about some cities in California, so sometimes I forget which aspect of the chapters were referring to Richmond in California and which ones were referring to Richmond in Virginia. But a lot of the practices, the segregated city planning practices, they started in Baltimore, which you would think it wouldn't be Baltimore, but it started in Baltimore and kind of trickled down and then over into other cities. So Chicago and New York, St. Louis, Seattle, Los Angeles, is just a little bit of everywhere in the country, which I thought was very interesting because a lot of people think that these practices were solely prevalent in southern states, and it's not. It was not. And we can see that even now in 2019, some of the aftermath or the effects of these laws that were put in place in the early 1900s. So I wanted to pull up, though, I won't go into it long. I'm already 3 minutes in, almost 4 minutes in, but there was something that I wanted to share because it was just so interesting. They had the Federal Housing Association, the FHA, or agency, I mess up my acronyms, but they were the first to kind of start instituting some things. Then you saw these, oh gosh, what did they call it? These covenants, racial covenants, that community associations that seem to act or function like a homeowners association, that they would put into place to be in line with whatever the FHA had put into law and in practice. But within the first 100 pages, they go into government enforcement about this. And it says, or it reads, in the FHA's finance program, a production builder who gained pre-approval for loans frequently inserted language in property deeds which preambles such as, quote, whereas the Federal Housing Administration requires that the existing mortgages on the said premises be subject and subordinated to the said restrictions, unquote. It's like, okay, what are we talking about here? It specifically means no lot or portion of a lot or building erected thereon shall be sold, leased, rented, or occupied by any other than those of the Caucasian race. This is the FHA in conjunction with local private agreements. Oh my goodness. It's absolutely crazy. I'm going to keep this less than 10 minutes, so let me keep rolling. So one of the cities other than my own, other than Richmond, I don't live in Richmond now, but I still live in an area that was affected by similar laws. But just looking at the news and seeing some of the areas that continue to be plagued by crime and violence, gang violence and drugs, and it being primarily inhabited by people of a certain race, it just made me wonder, okay, how did this happen? It just didn't make sense to me. Did everyone, all the black kids weren't trying to live together everywhere? It has to be something more than just us wanting to be around people who were like us. And it definitely was. And please don't think that I naively thought that there were no laws or anything in place. I just wasn't sure how deep segregation practices went. But this was one that I saw on page 105 of the book, referring to Chicago. A lot of us, we've heard about South Side Chicago. It says, on Chicago's South Side, signatures on a 1928 restrictive covenant were obtained in door-to-door solicitations by the priest of St. Anselm Catholic Church, the rabbi of Congregation Beth Jacob, and the executive director of the area's Property Owners Association. Trinity Congregational Church was also party to the agreement. In 1946, the Congregational Church of Park Manor sponsored a local improvement association's efforts to cancel an African-American physician's home purchase in the previously all-white neighborhood. So at first, it was said, like the verbiage that was put out in a lot of these laws and these local codes, it was said that they wanted to preserve the safety and the sanctity, essentially, of the Caucasian race. But here you had middle-class African Americans who sometimes were more well off, better off financially. They had higher status positions in society that were trying to move into these better neighborhoods. I keep doing that. Sorry, guys. So they made it seem as if they were just trying to keep out vagrant or lower class African Americans, but then they had to kind of switch things up and switch their tactics up. So here you have an African American family who is actually able to afford being in the neighborhood, and then it's like, no. Like, see, what we really meant was we just don't want any of you. It went so far. Oh my goodness, guys. Just where first-time home buyers, we hear about it now. First-time home buyers often have an opportunity to experience certain benefits that help in the process. Those were denied to African American families, and African American families were actually required to put 50% down on their homes versus, I believe it was 20% for white families. I might be wrong with my percentages. I will double check that. But the conditions, so once desegregation occurred and African Americans were allowed to start to trickle into these once all white neighborhoods, then the banks, the financial institutions, they made it so that it would be so hard for families to stay that a lot of families would default. They would miss one payment or be late, a little bit late, like 2 days late on one payment, and totally lose their opportunity for home ownership. They would totally be evicted. And when I said totally, I'm sorry that I sound a little ignorant with that. But it got to the point where even those who were not falling on having difficulty making payments, those who were able to afford it, they would wake up at night and have crosses burning outside of their homes. We've seen it in all of the movies. We've seen it depicted in Hollywood. They would have police officers who were supposed to protect the public welfare. They were not, they were there, they were present when this stuff was happening, but they weren't protecting the homeowners. They were protecting the people in the crowd because they agreed with the people in the crowd that these black people should not be living in the neighborhoods. So they would be sued. They'd be taken to court. Oh my goodness, y'all, I'm telling you. They would be taken to court by their neighbors. Neighbors would sue them. And the black families would have to pay not only the cost of their court costs, but they also had to pay the court costs of the neighbor who brought them to court. And they were evicted from homes that they had paid for. So needless to say, actually I feel like needless to say, because I feel like I've already touched on it with my my commentary. This book, it brought clarity. It helped me see the systematic ways of how government has a tendency to guide society in ways that we as the average American we allow it without question sometimes. We see the effects of it, but we really don't put the demands on those who represent us in the way that we should. We are not as educated, we're not as knowledgeable about the practices. Some of the other things that they talked about that don't just affect African Americans, or that didn't just affect African Americans, it was also a social class thing, which is why when people talk about the concept of white privilege, I go, you know what? I understand that there are some folks within who are Caucasian who don't feel the effects of or any benefits of white privilege. I understand that argument. I understand that perspective and point of view, because there were things that were done systematically, strategically, as far as legislation was concerned, as far as city planning was concerned, that prevented people who were poor or people who were low middle class from having access to better education, having access to better facilities, and just reading facts and reading minutes from city council meetings and things that were included in this book. Gosh, I went over 10 minutes, y'all. We're gonna go for 15. Just seeing how decisions are made to keep certain harmful businesses out of certain parts of town, but to cluster them around the lower classes, and causing so much havoc in those communities where people's health, their health is affected, their emotional, their physical health is affected, their education and career opportunities are affected. It just amazes me, just how much planning goes into creating a certain tiering system where a good portion of the population is not receiving the same benefits as others. I don't know how that motivates me to do things differently. But one thing I do know is I don't want to go on not being knowledgeable or not being educated about the issues. So this is the first edition of Bees Reads, and hopefully I'll have something a little bit more uplifting for you next time. I'm going to put the link to the book in the comments below, as well as a link to an interview with the author, not me interviewing him, but just a general interview. And I hope you guys check it out and let me know what you think about the segregated neighborhoods that we have here in the United States. See you next time.